In November 1942, in the humid jungles of New Guinea, an American colonel was about to directly violate high command orders and forever transform the war in the Pacific. Paul Irving Pappy Gunn wasn't just another officer. He was an obsessed visionary who saw something the generals in Washington simply couldn't grasp. While military strategists insisted that medium bombers should remain in their traditional high-altitude bombing roles, Gunn watched Japanese ships escape with impunity through the Pacific Straits and knew that something drastically needed to change. What he was about to do would not only challenge established military doctrine, but would create one of the most devastating anti-ship weapons in military aviation history. The transformation Gunn would initiate in an improvised hangar in Australia would not only save thousands of American lives, but completely redefine the concept of tactical air power. Few knew that this 48-year-old man, with his grease-stained hands and unwavering determination, was about to create what Japanese pilots would call the demon of the skies. The situation in the Pacific Theater in 1942 was desperate in a way few fully understood. The Japanese dominated sea lanes with brutal efficiency, moving troops and supplies through a network of fortified islands stretching for thousands of miles. B-25 Mitchell bombers, designed for medium-altitude bombing missions, were being used in conventional attacks that simply didn't work against moving naval targets. The problem was fundamental. When a bomber flew at 10,000 feet and dropped its bombs on a moving ship, accuracy was practically impossible. The bombs took precious seconds to fall, enough time for a Japanese destroyer to completely change course. Military statistics from the era revealed a devastatingly low hit rate of just 2% in conventional attacks against moving ships. For every 100 bombs dropped, only 2 found their targets. Meanwhile, Japanese ships continued transporting vital reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies to their isolated garrisons, prolonging a war that was costing American lives every day. Gunn knew there was a solution, but it would require breaking all the rules. Paul Pappy Gunn was not a military theorist sitting behind a desk in Washington. He was a man who had lost his family to the Japanese in the Philippines and carried a personal motivation that transcended any operations manual. Born in Arkansas in 1894, Gunn had served in World War I as a naval aviator before settling in the Philippines as a civilian pilot. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, his wife and children were trapped in occupied territory, a reality that transformed his military mission into a personal crusade. But Gunn possessed something most officers didn't: an intimate understanding of both aeronautical engineering and real combat tactics. He had spent years flying over the treacherous waters of the Pacific and knew every nuance of ship behavior in combat. When he arrived in Australia in 1942, as part of General George Kenney's 5th Air Force, Gunn brought with him not only experience, but a revolutionary vision that would challenge decades of military doctrine. He saw B-25s not as traditional bombers, but as flying artillery platforms that could take the fight directly to the decks of enemy ships. The question wasn't whether it would work, but whether he could convince his superiors before it was too late. Gunn's first unauthorized modification happened in a stuffy hangar in Townsville, Australia, under the skeptical gaze of mechanics who thought the colonel had lost his mind. Gunn ordered the complete removal of the bomber's nose section, eliminating the bombardier's position and the Norden bomb sight, equipment that cost thousands of dollars and was considered essential for the aircraft's mission. In its place, he installed 4 fixed 50-caliber machine guns pointing directly forward, but that was just the beginning. Gunn also added blisters, protrusions on the sides of the fuselage, each armed with additional machine guns. The end result was an aircraft with 8 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously forward, creating a cone of destruction that could unleash 800 rounds per minute on a target. To put this into perspective, each 50-caliber projectile weighed approximately 1.7 ounces and traveled at 2,910 feet per second. When 8 of these weapons fired simultaneously, they created a storm of metal that could pierce the hull of a Japanese destroyer as if it were paper. The mechanics who initially doubted Gunn soon realized they were witnessing the birth of something completely new, a bomber that had transformed into a heavy fighter with unprecedented firepower. The real test of Gunn's modifications came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, when his creations faced a Japanese convoy in one of the war's most brutal naval actions. The modified B-25s, flying at just 200 feet above the waves, approached the Japanese ships in a formation enemy sailors had never seen before. Instead of flying high and dropping bombs, these aircraft dove directly over the ship's decks, their 8 machine guns creating an inferno of projectiles that swept everything in their path. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Hall, piloting one of the modified B-25s, later reported, "It was like driving an armed freight train directly through the deck of an enemy ship. You could see the Japanese sailors scrambling for cover, but there was nowhere to hide." The machine guns not only caused massive casualties among the crew, but also destroyed vital systems, radar antennas, command towers, anti-aircraft artillery positions, and navigation equipment. Within minutes, Japanese warships that had dominated these waters for months were reduced to smoking, defenseless hulks. But Gunn had saved his most devastating innovation for last, the skip bombing technique, where bombs were released at low altitude to ricochet off the water like skipping stones, exploding against the ship's hulls below the waterline. The American High Command's reaction to Gunn's unauthorized modifications was initially one of horror and disbelief. Officials in Washington argued that Gunn had mutilated million-dollar aircraft and violated established protocols that existed for good reasons. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, received reports about the modifications with a mixture of fascination and concern. How could a bomber be effective without its precision bombing capability? How could pilots trained for high-altitude missions survive suicidal attacks at 200 feet altitude? But the numbers didn't lie. While conventional B-25s maintained their 2% hit rate against moving ships, Gunn's gunships were achieving destruction rates of over 60%. In a single mission over Wewak, New Guinea, 12 modified B-25s destroyed or severely damaged 18 Japanese ships, including 3 destroyers and 2 light cruisers. The cost? Only 1 aircraft lost. These results forced a complete re-evaluation of American air doctrine. What Gunn had proven was not just that his modifications worked, but that decades of military theory were fundamentally wrong. The war in the Pacific would not be won by high-altitude precision bombing, but by brutal direct attacks that brought the fight to the enemy's deck. The transformation of Gunn's B-25s into ship killers did not go unnoticed by the Japanese, who quickly developed an almost superstitious fear of these modified aircraft. Intercepted intelligence reports revealed that Japanese sailors had begun calling the modified B-25s Oni no Hikoki, literally demon aircraft. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, wrote in his personal diary about the new American threat that attacks like a samurai with a sword, not like a cowardly archer from afar. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Japanese ship crews reported that the characteristic sound of 8 .50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a roar that could be heard miles away, a harbinger of destruction that made experienced veterans tremble with fear. Japanese captains began avoiding certain sea routes entirely, preferring longer, more dangerous navigations through waters not patrolled by Gunn's ship killers. This change in behavior had enormous strategic consequences. Japanese supply lines were disrupted, isolated garrisons began to starve, and Japan's ability to reinforce its advanced positions was severely compromised. Gunn had created not just a weapon, but a tool of psychological warfare that was undermining Japanese morale throughout the Pacific theater. The success of Gunn's modifications forced North American Aviation, manufacturer of the B-25, to completely rethink the design of its aircraft. In 1943, the company began producing factory variants that incorporated Gunn's innovations, but taking them to even more audacious extremes. The B-25G introduced a weapon that even impressed Gunn, a 75mm cannon mounted in the aircraft's nose. This cannon, originally designed for Sherman tanks, was adapted for aerial use and could fire 15-pound projectiles capable of piercing the hull of any Japanese ship. The B-25H took this philosophy even further, adding 14 .50 caliber machine guns, 6 in the nose, 4 in side blisters, 2 in the dorsal turret and 2 in the tail position. With its 75mm cannon and 14 machine guns, a single B-25H possessed more frontal firepower than an entire destroyer. Test pilots reported that firing all weapons simultaneously created so much recoil that the aircraft visibly slowed down in the air. Lieutenant Robert Rugg, a North American test pilot, described the experience. "It was like trying to fly a volcano. You pulled the trigger, and the entire aircraft transformed into a flying artillery platform. The noise was deafening, the recoil was brutal, but the destructive power was absolutely unbelievable." These production aircraft fully validated Gunn's vision and set a new standard for attack aircraft that would influence military designs for decades. The skip bombing technique developed by Gunn and his pilots represented a tactical revolution that completely transformed anti-ship warfare in the Pacific. Instead of trying to hit a moving target from high altitude, the pilots of the modified B-25s flew at just 200–300 feet above the water and released their bombs at an angle that made them ricochet off the ocean's surface like stones being skipped by a child. This technique required extraordinary precision and courage. Pilots had to calculate not only the speed and direction of the target ship, but also the exact angle needed for the bomb to ricochet correctly. A properly released 500-pound bomb could ricochet off the water 3 or 4 times before hitting the ship's hull below the waterline, where the explosion caused catastrophic damage. Major Ed Lana, a veteran of 47 skip bombing missions, explained the technique. "You dive on the target like a hawk, your machine guns clearing the deck of any resistance, and then, at the last possible second, you release the bomb and hope your calculations are correct. If you miss the angle, the bomb could ricochet back and hit your own aircraft." Military statistics showed that skip bombing increased the hit rate against moving ships from 2% to an impressive 85%, transforming every mission from a desperate attempt into an almost guaranteed death sentence for any Japanese ship sighted. The strategic impact of Gunn's innovations extended far beyond individual battles, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Pacific theater. Between 1943 and 1945, the modified B-25s and their factory variants were responsible for the destruction of over 300 Japanese ships, including cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, and vital supply vessels. This devastation forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to abandon daytime operations in many areas, limiting themselves to nighttime movements that were less efficient and more dangerous. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Forces, noted in his reports that Colonel Gunn's modifications transformed the B-25 from a medium bomber into a strategic weapon that is strangling the lifelines of the Japanese Empire. The economic cost to Japan was astronomical. Each merchant ship destroyed represented not only the loss of the vessel, but also its vital cargo, food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment that would never reach isolated garrisons. Japanese islands that previously received regular supplies began to face starvation and ammunition shortages, forcing local commanders to make desperate decisions. Japan's strategy of defending an extensive perimeter through fortified islands began to crumble when these islands could no longer be adequately supplied. Gunn had created a weapon that attacked not just individual ships, but the entire Japanese military strategy in the Pacific. The legacy of Pappy Gunn's illegal innovations extends far beyond World War II, establishing design and tactical principles that continue to influence modern military aviation. His modifications proved that battlefield innovation, even when it violates established protocols, can be more valuable than years of theoretical planning in boardrooms. The concept of specialized attack aircraft, born from Gunn's improvised hangars in Australia, evolved to create entire lineages of military aircraft: the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the AC-130 gunship, and countless other platforms that prioritize devastating firepower over conventional bombing capabilities. More importantly, Gunn demonstrated that modern warfare demands constant flexibility and adaptation. His modifications saved thousands of American lives by significantly shortening the war in the Pacific, proving that a man with vision and determination can alter the course of history. When Gunn finally reunited with his family after the war, he carried with him not only the satisfaction of victory, but the certainty that he had forever transformed the nature of aerial warfare. Today, when modern pilots fly specialized attack aircraft, they are following a path laid by an obstinate colonel who refused to accept that "it's always been done this way" was an adequate answer to the challenges of his time. The true measure of Gunn's genius lies not just in the ships he sank, but in the conceptual revolution he initiated. The idea that any aircraft can be transformed into a more effective weapon if you have enough courage to break the rules.